Hi again. This is Latin American Studies 3300, and this is our second class, and today we're going to talk about a number of topics which I have up here on the outline. We will continue to talk about really what we had been talking about at the end of class last week, and that is the European and Iberian background to the encounter and the conquests. And then we're going to talk about a specific example of conquest, and that is the conquest of the Aztecs, which is the best known conquest because it is the best documented, but it also is the most important conquest. It's the conquest that really allowed the Spanish to understand the wealth in material goods, people, and lands that it was possible to find and conquer in the Americas. And the conquest of the Aztecs, and I'll talk about the term Aztec a little later today, but the conquest of the Aztecs really involved the conquest of their capital city known as Tenochtitlan, which Professor Kuntz had mentioned. And Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world at that time, and the conquest of Tenochtitlan very possibly is the single largest conquest of a particular place that has ever occurred in world history. So it is important for that reason as well, and it makes it important for us and a good example of the process of conquest and the consequences of conquest, if I can put it that way. And so we need to talk about what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and we'll do that today. And then we'll also talk about the Spanish colonizing process. And that's important as well, not only because it is important to understand the institutions that the Spanish put in place, but it's also important to understand that the conquest was really just one step in what's a really complicated process of human relations, social relations, technological change. And it's that process of change that allows Spain to become a colonial empire, allows it to become an imperial power in Europe, and thereby allows Spain to create a model that had a great deal of influence for other colonizing projects, not only on the Portuguese and how the Portuguese colonized Brazil, but for the French, the Dutch, and especially for the English. Although the English saw themselves as very different from the Spanish, and there were many differences in the way that England and Great Britain ran their colonies as compared to the Spanish. The Spanish really did set the model that others either followed or reacted to. And so that helps explain why understanding the Spanish experience is so important. And of course, the colonial period and the colonial experience is crucial for understanding Latin American history and for understanding Latin American countries, societies, and political and economic processes of change. Even when we want to understand those in their contemporary forms, understanding what happened in the colonial period is crucial, because what happened then underlies the way that those societies, their political systems, and their economic systems developed and evolved over time. But before we get to any of that, I want to spend a few minutes looking at maps. And that's what I have on the screen now. Yes, there it is. The first map, there are two maps I want us to spend some time looking at, and you will also find some maps in the textbook and the book of readings that you have for the semester. It is important to have a sense of the location of the countries of Latin America, especially the countries that will be of the greatest interest for us this semester. So, of course, we see Mexico, and then we see Belize and Guatemala here, which are part of the unit that I talked about as constituting Mesoamerica. Below that, we find the countries of Central America. Then we see South America, and I've already talked about Brazil. That's been mentioned. We will not be able to cover every country that is part of South America, but we will talk about Brazil. We will talk about Argentina and Chile. We will talk about Peru. We will talk about Colombia and Venezuela, and other countries such as Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay may well be mentioned along the way, but it's those major countries and regions that we will spend the most time on this semester when we talk about countries in South America. There's also the Caribbean, and I talked about the countries and islands that are important, that were important both in the period of exploration and the colonial period, as well as today, of course, Cuba. And Cuba has a great importance not only because of its place in the early colonial period, and I'll talk more about that today, because Cuba was the launching ground for the Cortez expedition, which would be the expedition that will participate in the conquest of the Aztecs. We have Cuba. We have the island of Hispaniola, which has the countries today, it's constituted by the countries Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And there is the island of Puerto Rico as well, which is part of the United States. So that's the map of Latin America. You can see, as I mentioned in class last week, that it's very large. It has a huge landmass. It has a very large population. Politically, socially, it has close relations, though sometimes conflictual relations with the United States. And understanding the geography, just understanding the basic geography, is important for understanding Latin America and understanding Latin American studies. And next is the map of Iberia. This is the Iberian Peninsula, and as I talked about last week, it lies between the southern part of Europe and the northern part of Africa. In the western region here, we have today's modern Kingdom of Portugal, and the modern nation of Portugal, and the Kingdom of Portugal was pretty much the same, had pretty much the same square miles, was fairly similar to the nation of Portugal today. And then, while the modern nation of Spain is somewhat larger than the regions that we're talking about during the colonial period, the Kingdom of Castile was here, made up much of the center of what is today Spain, and the Kingdom of Aragon was up in the north here. And those are the regions that were not politically united, but were in many ways socially and religiously united by Ferdinand and Isabella, and I'll come back to that. And there's a question over here. Oh, okay, let me, I have a copy of my map. Yeah, you do need to use the table mics. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Good, thank you. Okay. I know all you watching are enjoying me getting instruction on this while the class is going on, but there it goes. Okay, so let me... Okay, this is a smaller version of the map, but we can still look at it. Mexico here, I'll go over this again quickly. Mexico here, Mesoamerica here, Central America here, and then we've been, okay, thank you. South America here with Brazil, whoops. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and then in the Caribbean, we have the island of Cuba. Here's the island of Hispaniola with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And Puerto Rico is here. Clear? Okay, good. Okay, here's the peninsula of Iberia. Here's southern France. Portugal would have been, the Kingdom of Portugal would have been roughly here. Then this is Spain today, and the Kingdom of Castile was much of the center of what is today Spain, and then the Kingdom of Aragon is here in the north. And those are the two regions, the two areas that Ferdinand and Isabella sought to unite, not necessarily politically, and I will talk about that later, but they united it in the sense of sharing projects of governance which brought those two areas together. Any questions about the maps? Okay. Yeah, sure. Can you? Yeah.
I guess my question was, during the colonization of South America or Latin America, were Aragon and the Kingdom of Aragon and Castile united yet, or they were not?
By the time of the conquest of Mexico, they had become united, but Spain in its modern form still did not exist because there were still other independent kingdoms, which were ruled by their own sovereigns, but there were increasingly united projects of governance, and the region was beginning to come together. What I want to pick up with talking about now is Iberia, and some of its characteristics, especially the characteristics of Castile and Aragon. And this is in relation to the role of the Reconquest and the role that the Reconquest played in shaping the characteristics of the nation that will become Spain. And we finished up last week by talking about some of these characteristics of the Spain that is emerging in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. But I'll review the last points of the lecture from last week and what we were going over, and then go on to finish this aspect of the history of Iberia and Spain, and then talk a little more specifically about Ferdinand and Isabella. And then we'll get into some of the other points that I'd like to cover today. So in terms of the Reconquest and its impact on Spain, we talked about how one of the characteristics of the Reconquest is it led to strong monarchs and strong institutions of central governance. And the reason for that, of course, is that warfare had the effect of bringing people together. And to be successful in war, you need to have strong institutions of leadership. And so, since monarchies already existed, the impact of the Reconquest was to strengthen those, particularly those where the Christian monarchs were successful. The tendency towards urbanization also makes sense in terms of what's happening in Iberia at this time, because there is a need for more fortification, there is a need for more protection, and of course people will gather together in order to take advantage of that, and people gathering together helps create the economic and political conditions through which protective architecture and with which armies can function more effectively. So urbanization and the urbanization of Spain is also related to the Reconquest. Another important aspect of the Reconquest, and I think that we had talked about this last week, and I think in fact this was the point that we ended on, and this is the characteristic aspect of Spanish rule in Spain itself that is so important for the Spanish when they come into the New World, and that is that the Spanish have already had experience, an experience that they developed during the Reconquest with governing over ethnically and religiously different groups of people. So they are already used to dealing with Muslim populations and Jewish populations. These populations were, in terms of the overall Spanish population, they were smaller, especially as we get into the 1592 period, and I'll give you some population figures in a little bit. But they were still, especially in the areas where they were concentrated, Muslims in the south, Jews in many of the major cities, especially in the areas where they were concentrated, they did make up a relatively large proportion of the population, and certainly large enough so that these were groups that the monarchs of the kingdoms of Spain had to deal with. And early in the Reconquest period, although there are the battles of the Reconquest taking place, once areas were conquered by Christian forces, the principle that the Spanish based their form of rule upon was this idea of convivencia, living together, or coexistence, as the term can also be translated. Convivencia, or coexistence, was the cultural value that was very real in late medieval and Renaissance Spain, that expressed the idea that communities and peoples of varying religious and ethnic traditions could live together in relative peace. If communities that had been conquered said that they would live peacefully and would pay taxes or tribute to a monarch, then the monarchs, especially the monarchs in the period before about 1400, monarchs of that earlier period, were pretty well disposed to let those groups of people carry on their own traditions. They did not force them to convert to Catholicism. And in the areas that had been conquered, Spain did achieve relative peace. It found methods that worked in terms of coexistence. And one of the really important aspects of that period And one of the most important aspects of convivencia is the idea that Spain developed legal codes that talked about, the kingdoms of Spain, especially the Kingdom of Castile, developed legal codes that talked about how to deal with different and subjugated groups of people. And that's very important, and it is a point I'll also come back to later today. It's important because it helps us understand that when Spain went first into the Caribbean and then into the mainland areas, they weren't developing the institutions of governance out of thin air. They were using institutions they had already developed, in many cases changing them. And the institutions will change and develop over time in Latin America, because in Latin America, the circumstances, the cultures, and the groups are very different. And they're not in Spain, where the people with whom the Spanish are dealing are groups that the Spanish themselves outnumber and surround, and that demographic context creates a difference as well. But the most important point here is that the institutions that the Spanish will depend upon were institutions that already existed and that really come out of the Reconquest. So convivencia is very important. At the same time, and it's kind of odd to make this point because now it's going to sound like I'm making the exact opposite point, and you can ask me about that if I don't explain it clearly. But at the same time, over time, because of the military and religious pressures of the relationship between Catholic Spaniards and Muslim Spaniards, and the growing conflict between them as the Reconquest goes on and the Catholic Spaniards are expanding their territory yet are frustrated that what they see as their territory, Iberia, still has regions that are controlled by Islamic rulers. As that goes on, and this is also reinforced, of course, by events elsewhere in Europe and the Middle East, Catholic Castilians develop an increasingly real crusading spirit. That is, increasingly, they see it as important that the population of Iberia be united religiously, so that religious tolerance that is built into the concept and the laws relating to convivencia begins to give way to much greater intolerance. I'll come back to the point of intolerance. What I'd like to emphasize about the crusading spirit now, as I talk about the impact of the Reconquest, is that this aspect of the consequences of the Reconquest is also very important, not only because it shows the way that Spain joined in the crusading spirit of Western Europe of this time, but also because some of the practices and institutions relating to missionizing, relating to evangelization, relating to conversion, some of these institutions that are used in the Americas, where priests do this incredible job of working with so many different people, speaking so many different languages, and implanting a new religion. The institutions used by the Catholic Church, used by the priests, and relied on by the Spanish state come back to this period of the Reconquest and grew out of the desire on the part of the monarchs of various kingdoms of Spain at this time to create kingdoms that were more religiously unified. So on the one hand, convivencia gives birth to a legal tradition and political traditions that are very useful. as Spain moves into the Caribbean and then onto the mainland areas of Middle America and South America. On the other hand, as the crusading spirit gives way, as the spirit of convivencia gives way to a crusading spirit, that form of Catholicism that says that people really do need to practice the same religion in order to unify these regions, that idea becomes very important as well, because the institutions that develop out of that idea play a role within and beyond Spain. And the role that the church plays is a very, very important one. Another point, yes?
I was wondering, what would you consider the most important factor or factors that led to, that led from the idea of convivencia to the Inquisition? Would you say, what led to such a big change, and also if there are any specific dates you should know?
Okay, I will talk about the factors and some of the dates when I talk about Ferdinand and Isabella. But let me answer the question somewhat generally now, and then I'll provide a more specific answer after I talk about the rest of the points relating to the Reconquest. I think that perhaps the most important intervening factor, and this is in the mid and late 15th century, has to do with Ferdinand and Isabella and their project of rule, which is not necessarily to unite the Iberian Peninsula politically, because they're not yet thinking about forming the nation state of Spain. What they are thinking about is spreading a Catholic identity, and they see the spread of the identity as crucial to their joint project of governing. And then when the New World is discovered, once again, for a multitude of reasons which I will try to come back to later on today, but for a multitude of reasons, the church is placed in the position of playing an important role in creating the colony. It can't be the only colonizer, because there are other kinds of power and other aspects of governance that are very important. But it does play a very important role. Though I would say that the role of the Americas, I'm trying to think about how to say this, because I want to explain it carefully, because I don't want to be heard to be undermining the sincerity of belief that priests and governing officials had in relation to their ideas about Catholicism, which they believed in very sincerely. But I think that perhaps the main reason why religion is so important in the Americas is that there is no way that the Spanish can create a government that's powerful enough to deal with the vast region and millions of people that they encountered. And since they had already developed institutions like the Inquisition that were useful, though the Inquisition will not be the only religious institution that plays an important role, because they had developed institutions that were useful, that were effective in Spain in creating a more religiously unified population, not that the institutions didn't lead to certain kinds of conflict as well, those institutions will work well and were very adaptable to the purposes and for the circumstances that the Spanish found in the Americas. But before I talk about the institutions of governance, let me come back to the point about the importance of the Reconquest. We've talked about strong monarchs, we've talked about urbanization, we've talked about convivencia and its opposite, the crusading spirit. The last two consequences of the Reconquest, which will be important for understanding the role of Spain in the 15th and 16th centuries, is first of all, this tremendously high value that the Spanish place on war. Now that seems almost, I think that seems almost as if that's what I'm talking about. That's what the Reconquest is all about. And in a sense that's true because the Reconquest is a series of battles and wars. But the point I want to make here in relation to the importance of war is that war is important and the military is important, in part because war is a constant part of life that has these other consequences. But it's also important because this is a class-based society in which the position to which you are born is very important. It shapes a lot about your life. Mobility is hard. Social mobility is hard to achieve in a monarchical and class-based society. And what becomes the primary means of mobility? The military. If you are successful in battle, if you are successful in warfare, if you uphold the cultural values placed on courage, endurance, and honor as part of warfare, as part of the military experience, then that may help you raise your position in society. This was true in the Reconquest. It is also true in the period of exploration and conquest in the Americas. Many of the men who accompanied the early explorers and conquerors had experience in Reconquest battles that had served as their military training, and they certainly saw coming to the Americas, participating in these events as a way of raising their status, as a pathway to wealth. Finally, the Reconquest had some important economic effects. One of the most important economic effects, and I think it's the one that I'll concentrate on here now, one of the most important economic effects of the Reconquest is that because the Reconquest went on for so long, the Reconquest undermined agriculture because fields were easy to destroy. Fields and crops were easy to destroy. That meant that for the wealthy, investment in agriculture was highly problematic. That also meant that while farming was important and it was an activity, it was an economic activity in the Spain of this period, people weren't necessarily anxious to be farmers. And one of the most important economic activities that took the place of farming was actually ranching and the rearing of sheep. And it's sheep, not cattle, that are important in Spain in this period. And why can you raise sheep? And why are they valuable in this period? Well, you can raise them even under conditions of war, because if you have to get away, you can move them. Which isn't to say that they didn't become fought over at times, but they were more practical because it's a mobile activity. So the rearing of animals, and in this case primarily sheep, was more practical. Sheep are valuable because textiles made of wool were valuable within and beyond Spain. And trading in textiles across Europe is growing greatly during this period. Spain does gain some wealth from this economic activity. Nonetheless, it leads to some problems. The first one and most important economic problem that comes out of the Reconquest is that the Spanish, the kingdoms of Spain, cannot feed their own people. In the 15th century, the kingdoms of Spain had a population of roughly 10 million. So it's a fairly large populated region. The kingdoms of Spain cannot feed their own people. And so Spanish merchants have to trade wool for food. There were often food shortages. Food shortages led sometimes to riots. And there's a lot of economic instability in Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries. Even with the finding of the Americas and the wealth that that generated, in terms of the patterns of movement of the wealth, this did not help the Spanish to feed their own people. The other weakness is a weakness within Spain itself that will extend to the Americas, and that is that the Spanish don't like farming very much. They don't place a very heavy value on manual labor. That's a problem in Spain because of the need for food, as I've already mentioned, but it becomes a problem in colonial Latin America as well, because one of the issues for the Spanish in Latin America is a very simple question, and that is, well, if we don't want to farm for ourselves, how are we going to feed ourselves? And that relates to the whole issue of the economic system that the Spanish develop and put in place. And I'll return to that issue of the economic system and labor, which is very important. I'll return to that issue later today. As a result of the Reconquest, however, what we see with Spain in the 15th and early 16th centuries is that this is a society that can administer diverse populations. It highly values military achievement and military skill. It's wealthy in land, it's wealthy in resources, yet it also has certain economic weaknesses. And those economic weaknesses not only help to explain some aspects of the colonial project, they also help to explain why it is that Spain, by the late 16th century, with the largest empire in the world, will not remain the dominant colonial power for long. Be that as it may, what is important for us to understand right now is that, in a sense, the experience of the Reconquest and the way it shaped Spanish society, culture, and history before 1492, in a sense, pre-adapted Spain for the role that it will come to play in the Americas. In the mid-15th century, Ferdinand in Aragon and Isabella in the Kingdom of Castile become monarchs who will rule into the early 16th century. And who will play such an important role in the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. Ferdinand and Isabella were married in 1469. Isabella was not first in succession to the throne of Castile, but she took the throne with the support of many nobles and many towns and cities in Castile. And after taking the throne, Isabella in Castile and Ferdinand in Aragon, they set about to undertake joint projects of rule. But what is important to understand before I talk a little bit about the joint projects of rule and the way that they tried to reform and modernize their kingdoms, modernize in the 15th and 16th century sense of the term, it is important to understand that their marriage contracts carefully subordinated each of them in the kingdom of the other. So that Ferdinand could not become the ruler of Castile, he was not the ruler of Castile, and Isabella was not the ruler of Aragon. Each of them ruled over their own kingdom, but their policies tended to be jointly carried out. They did have a close marriage, which didn't foreclose Ferdinand from engaging in some social projects, as monarchs want to do sometimes. But they did have a close marriage, and they had a close governing relationship. So many of their policies, as I've said, were jointly carried out. Because the policies were jointly carried out, this helped to give Spain an emergent national identity. But the kingdoms legally and politically did remain separate. What were their joint projects of governance? Well, there were several. The most important of which are, first of all, they were determined to curtail and control any institutions which they saw as threatening the central power of the monarchy. The church, town governments, the nobility. They wanted to make it clear that each of these institutions was to be under the power, either formally or informally, of the monarchs. That is, these were not to be centers of power that could in any way compete with them. In terms of the clergy and the Catholic Church, Ferdinand and Isabella were contributors to the Church, to the Pope in Rome, and in exchange for their contributions and also in celebration of the conquest of the Kingdom of Granada in 1492, which represented the end of the Reconquest, the Catholic Church gave Ferdinand and Isabella certain rights of patronage to appoint priests, to high positions who were loyal to them. For those of you who've studied European history, you know that the relationship between church and state was fraught. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In Spain, in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, the monarchy had a strong influence over the church, and the church played an important role. After the Reconquest was over, in consolidating the role of Catholicism and the increasing unification of the Spanish population religiously, the church also played a very important role in the conversion project in the Americas. The ability to name priests to high positions was an important one that Ferdinand and Isabella used to forge a close relationship with the clergy, but a relationship that they could count on as serving their needs and their project of governance. In terms of the government itself, another important aspect of their rule was their tendency in every aspect of government, most especially the economy, but in a sense the economic realm is only one example of this tendency. Their tendency was to create councils, new councils, to which they would make the appointments. These councils and the men who served on them were educated, and they were new parts of the bureaucracy that was being created to manage the Spanish kingdoms in a more centralized and bureaucratic fashion. Councils will play an important role in the governance of the New World. But again, the idea was that the councils and their members were to be subordinate to the monarchs. And what the monarchs want from the councils is professional advice and information. But the councils are not to serve as centers of power. The councils are to be loyal, and they are subjugated. In terms of economic policy is to be run in a centralized way. It is to be protectionist. That is, the idea of it is to control trade and the movement of goods in and out of Spain. Economic decisions are to be made in a way that does not allow for free trade or free competition. And the idea is that this will enhance the value of Spanish goods. The problem is that Spain is not wealthy enough in and of itself to support the high prices for goods that the monarchs desire. And this creates a variety of economic problems that I don't want to talk about now, but that will become important in understanding what happens to Spain and Spain's relationship with Latin America over time. In all ways, the interest of Isabella and Ferdinand is to enlarge, but at the same time protect their realm. The first way that they are challenged in terms of protecting their realm, of course, relates to the Reconquest. The last great battles of the Reconquest were fought during their period of rule. The Christian armies were victorious, the last Muslim area. Granada was conquered in 1492. And Ferdinand and Isabella have to decide how to rule over this large and very populated area. Their emphasis is on harsher policies than those that had been the practice during the period of convivencia. And in general, in terms of religion, they relied upon forced conversion as the means by which the Muslim population of Granada would be brought under Spanish Catholic rule. There were many successes that were part of Ferdinand and Isabella's rule. The ending of the Reconquest, the discovery of the Americas were two of the most important. The modernizing of the government, in many ways, was also a success of their period of rule. But there were problems that accompanied their period of rule as well. One set of problems I think I can just sum up by saying that there were a series of economic problems that they were never successful in dealing with. The ownership of land in the kingdoms of Spain was very concentrated. It was intensely concentrated. Figures suggest that in the kingdoms of Spain, in the 1490s, only about 3% of the population owned 95% of the land. That's pretty concentrated and pretty problematic. Because what that means is not only do you have this conflict between agriculture and sheep raising, where sheep win out, which creates shortages of food, but you have a peasantry, a large peasant population in Spain, which is very poor. It can't feed itself. And many people, many people have a lot of difficulty supporting themselves. Given the fact that Spain of the late 15th and early 16th century is a relatively poor country, even with an enlarging realm, this means that the forms of proto-industrial development and trade that are being experienced in other parts of Europe, Spain cannot partake of those to the same extent. It will rely on the riches of the Americas to cover over these economic problems, but eventually even the riches of the Americas cannot overcome the poverty that exists within Spain and the inability of Spanish monarchs to do much about that. And I think there was a question.
Yes, I wondered if you could repeat, you said Spain cannot participate in the
proto-industrial development and the development of trade that's taking place in the rest of Europe, because this is the period where merchants are emerging as a very important force.
Okay, so because you said that Spain was not a wealthy enough country to have a closed economy.
Mm-hmm. And it was not wealthy enough country to have an open economy. It had it tried to have a closed economy. But what actually happened is that in trying to have a closed economy, what then emerges is a lot of illegal trade. And trade that's not under control, and that creates wealth that flows out because it can't be taxed, rather than creating wealth, a portion of which either comes in or stays in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So there are a lot of economic problems. And there's all sorts of pressure. Because on the one hand, Spain is emerging as what is a global power for that time. On the other hand, it has a large, very poor population that is religiously and ethnically divided. So in poor economic times, but times in which some people are profiting greatly, what can be the result of that? I've already said there are food shortages and riots. And given that there are deep religious differences which still exist in the period from the late 15th century and into the early 16th century, what can be a result of that? What can happen? And there's a crusading spirit where the idea of convivencia is pretty much gone. What about scapegoating? Is scapegoating sometimes a result of the kind of conditions that I'm talking about here? Well, scapegoating is sometimes a result. And what happens is that Muslim, Catholic, and Jewish groups, these people do not get along with each other very well. There's competition for food, there's competition for jobs, there's competition for positions in government. And what begins to happen is that there are increasing kinds of social conflicts. And some Catholic officials begin to believe that there is too much disunity, too much diversity or difference religiously. And they also begin to question the pace of conversion, because I've already said that Ferdinand and Isabella decide that they are going to emphasize conversion rather than convivencia at the end of the Reconquest. But some officials, Catholic officials, decide that the pace of conversion is too slow. And what they want to do in order to force more conversion is to carry out forced baptisms, both of children and of others in the population as well. Forced conversions and forced baptisms led to riots and revolts. And in 1502, Isabella decreed in Castile that the Muslim population of the kingdom had to choose between baptism and exile. Many did choose to convert, but many chose to leave. In this period, Granada, the Kingdom of Granada, had a population of about 500,000. About 100,000 of those were killed or enslaved as part of the end of the wars of the Reconquest. About 200,000 left, and about 200,000 converted. So that's quite a large number. But the problem with the conversions, the problem with those who converted and the problem for those who converted was that Catholics increasingly came to believe, as they will about the Jewish population as well, Catholics increasingly came to believe that the conversions weren't true, that they were only on the surface, that they weren't a true and deep experience. So the idea is that the monarchs are saying, we force you to convert, but we don't really believe in the conversion that you have taken part in. And this same set of ideas and experiences happened with the Jewish population as well. The Jewish population was smaller. In Castile, the Jewish population numbered between 200 and 300. The total number was between 200,000 and 300,000. In 1492, they were given the choice of conversion or exile. So this actually happened first with the Jewish population, then 10 years later with the Muslim population. The Jews who converted were known as conversos. And again, the conversos were faced with this dilemma of Catholics saying, we are forcing you to convert, but we don't really believe that you have fully converted. So that this led to a number of problems. One, it meant that the people who had made the decision to convert were always under suspicion. And the thing I think we have to realize is that when you convert by force, even if you make the choice sincerely, if you're an adult converting, unless you change everything about how you view the world, it's very difficult to take on a wholly new belief system and practice it perfectly and have it permeate your total being, because you've been raised another way. It's like learning a language. It's like anything that's deeply a part of you. How are you going to change that almost overnight, no matter how sincere you are? That's a very hard thing to do. So it creates all sorts of problems in daily life for people who undergo this forced conversion experience. And then oftentimes we know also that when we're forced to do something, even if we know or we think we should do it, it's not easy to make yourself do it, because we respond to that. People respond to that negatively. Sure.
You had stated earlier that because the Reconquest gave them sort of these institutions in which they could later imply or put in the Americas. When they were doing these, when Ferdinand and Isabella decide that they're going to convert people in their own country, in their own kingdoms by force, and this is the result of what's happening, increasing social conflicts, why do they do that in the Americas as well? Is it because it was just part of what they knew?
In large part, it's because it's what they knew, what they believed to be right. And they believed that, in fact, they believed that they had been rewarded for the Reconquest and for their efforts to create a nation that was unified religiously, even if it wasn't unified politically. They believed that the finding of the Americas was a reward for that, and therefore the same activities that they were carrying out in Spain were appropriate to carry out in the Americas. They believed that you had to be Catholic, but they also believed that becoming Catholic was part of the project of colonizing the region, that it wasn't possible to rule it without the population converting. The two went hand in hand. Also, and I will talk about this again, I'll come back to this point later today, that there was a practical element to this as well that I alluded to earlier. That is, there could never be enough bureaucrats, given the very large populations that existed in the core areas of the Americas and of what becomes Latin America. And therefore, there is a certain sense in which the state needed the church to play a certain role. And because it's been so effective in developing a sort of partnership with the church in which the monarchy is the senior partner, they feel that that relationship will work successfully in Mexico and in Peru, which become the centers of population in the New World. Yeah.
Also, Chastain makes a point in the book that a lot of the conquistadors and colonizers actually thought that they were doing the enslaved Africans and the indigenous people a favor by converting them and bringing them to the light of Christianity. So it was, I guess, the conviction of religious righteousness that they thought it was their duty, and that even if they were enslaving them, to convert them and force them to work, that it was justified.
Absolutely. I like the phrase religious righteousness, because many of the Spaniards who come to the New World and participate in the conquest absolutely carry that idea. Sometimes the conquest is referred to with the following terms. It's the search for God, gold, and glory. And to use the word God there is to imply this idea that it's the search for spreading Catholicism to these people who haven't experienced, and many who haven't experienced, and many of the people participating in the conquest, many of the men participating in the conquest really do think of it as a sort of gift. Giving the gift raises many, many issues, though, that have to do with the implantation of colonial rule, which is something that we'll talk about at greater length. But before we get to that point, we need to finish up talking about Iberia by talking briefly about the role of the Inquisition. And then we'll be able to talk about the Aztecs, the conquests, and the institutions of colonial rule. But in terms of the Inquisition, there are only a few points about that I'd like to make, and that is that the term Inquisition is sometimes a term that is misunderstood. The term Inquisition refers to special religious courts which are designed to root out heresy. As the courts of the Inquisition developed in Spain, and this was an institution that developed over time in the 14th and 15th centuries, the courts of the Inquisition developed first to scrutinize those of Jewish heritage who had converted to Christianity. These people were known as conversos, and the belief was common that conversos often secretly practiced Jewish rituals and ceremonies and held to Jewish religious beliefs. In 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella signed edicts expelling those Jews who did not convert, about 250,000 left and 50,000 remained. The 50,000 who remained were subject to a great deal of scrutiny because of this distrust of their conversion. They were often denounced secretly. Individuals were denounced secretly to the Inquisition courts. They were then investigated. They had little opportunity to answer or to provide evidence for themselves. they were punished harshly, often physically punished. Some would die, some were executed, but many others would die in the harsh conditions of imprisonment that they had to endure. The Inquisition is an institution that came under scrutiny at the time and ever after. It's seen as a unique symbol of Spanish intolerance. It certainly is an example of intolerance. But what's most important about the Inquisition and about this aspect, the religious aspect of Ferdinand and Isabella's rule, is that Ferdinand and Isabella, however personally tolerant they actually were, because there's plenty of evidence to suggest that on a personal level they were tolerant, they used intolerance and they made use of and believed in the crusading spirit of Catholicism and Christianity to forge a national identity that was centered not on a political definition of the nation state, but on a cultural and religious definition of Spanish identity. That notion of religious identity as fundamentally connected to cultural identity is one that will have many implications and many consequences in Latin America. Latin America may be religiously diverse today, and it may be overstating it to see it as 100% completely Catholic at any point in the past. But there is little doubt that Catholicism played a key role historically, both in the colonial period and later on, as Catholic beliefs were very important in the shaping of cultural and political traditions in Latin America. So Catholicism and the way that it came into Latin America is crucial for understanding Latin American society, culture, and history, both past and present. The Spaniards, as Professor Kuntz talked about in his lecture last week, once they discovered the Americas, the Spanish came into regions which were populated, and not only which were populated, but which in some areas were populated by groups and societies that were themselves highly developed. And what I want to talk about and introduce now is to talk about Aztec culture. What was it like? We talked a little bit about that last week, but we didn't get to it in much detail. What was it like? And more importantly, how was it similar to or different from Spanish and Iberian culture? Because I think that helps us understand the encounter and the conquest in greater detail. And I think there was a question.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a confusion.
Sure.
The Spanish, they're occupying Castillo and Aragon so far, and that's...
Well, Castile and Aragon are in Iberia, and those are the constituent kingdoms of what will become the nation of Spain.
Okay.
And it's
But when you refer to the Spanish, you're referring to those two?
Primarily those two kingdoms, though there were people from other regions who begin to participate, of Spain, who begin to, what becomes Spain,
Yeah.
who begin to participate
so
in the
far,
conquest.
where we are.
Yeah,
in history,
as the Spanish come into the Americas, they are primarily people from those two kingdoms, especially the southern part of Castile.
okay.
Historians use the term Spanish because it's inconvenient to keep referring to Castilians and others. So they use the term Spanish, but the nation Spain doesn't really exist at this time. So when historians talk about Spain, it's a shorthand for talking about people primarily from those two kingdoms. But what I want to turn to now is to talk about the Aztecs, and the point I want to make is that the term Aztec is a big term that can refer to all the people who spoke the Nahuatl language in the late 15th and early 16th century in the Valley of Mexico, but it also can be used to refer to a smaller group that were at the center of the Aztec Empire, and I'll pick up with that after the break.